AA Beyond Belief is a podcast by, for, and about people who have found a secular path to sobriety and Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, according to the site adoptionnetwork.com, 135,000 children in the United States are adopted each year, and another 428,000 children are in foster care. Among these children, males outnumber females, African American children are disproportionately represented, and over half are 6 years old or older. There are 1.5 million adopted children in the United States. And according to a study at the Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond in 2012, about 4.5% of adopted individuals have or have had problems with substance abuse, compared to 2.9% for the general population. The study also said that adopted children have twice the risk of drug abuse if either their biological, full, or half sibling had a drug abuse problem, or if their adopted siblings had drug abuse problems. So why do adopted individuals have a disproportionate disposition for substance abuse? So we have two guests today who will help us answer that question. Lisa Kay is a Korean adoptee and a person in recovery. Her expertise on the topic comes from her personal experience. Lisa has freely and openly shared her story, and it's really nice to have her here. And David B. Bohl, the author of Parallel Universes, The Story of Rebirth. David is a certified master addiction counselor and a member of the National Association of Alcoholism and Drug Abuse Counselors, the American Adoption Congress, and Concerned United Birth Parents. As a person who's been adopted, or as he would say, relinquished, he understands adoption trauma firsthand. And as a professional addiction counselor and person in recovery with an interest in adoption issues, he's the perfect guest to help us explore and learn about this topic. Hello, Lisa and David. Welcome to AA Beyond Belief.
Hello, John. Hi, Angela. Glad to be here.
Nice
Thank
to have
you, John.
Good to have you, Lisa. And Angela, I think you're going to find this an interesting topic because it does have a lot to do with trauma. And that's an interesting.
I know. I was going to say that I was a trauma junkie, and then I'm like, oh no, junkie is not the right word. I'm like trauma enthusiast. No, that. Anyway, I need more words. But yes, I'm excited about this show.
And I'm glad that you had an opportunity to read David's book, Parallel Universes. It's a beautiful book. You learn a lot about the issues surrounding adopted people, and you learn a lot about David, and you just learn a lot about recovery in general. It's a book I highly recommend. Very well written. So, where to start? I thought what we might want to do, since we have two guests here, why don't we start with Lisa? If Lisa, you could share your story about, 5-10 minutes, whatever, and then we'll just take it from there. And why don't you have the floor, Lisa? It's yours.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Lisa, and I was adopted in the 60s. I'm a Korean adoptee, and in those days it wasn't so common, and I was adopted into a white family. So a lot of my story is around identity and race issues, because as a small child, when I first came to AA, I heard people say about being uncomfortable in their skin, and I truly was uncomfortable in my skin my whole life, because even though I was raised in this culture, when I go out in the world, I'm still an Asian person. That's who people see. So I grew up with a lot of feelings of self-hatred. I didn't want to be Asian. I wanted to be white like my siblings. Also, we talk about racial isolation. So I also did not socialize with other Asian people because I didn't have, anything in common. So what I heard in the rooms when I was new is about that just wanting to belong. And for me, I just kind of stuck out. I was always awkward and very, very shy. And also I wanted to touch on, for me, I still to this day, I'm 56 now, no idea of really when I was born or where I was born, or many of our birth certificates back in the 60s and maybe even through the 70s and 80s are fabricated. So we don't even have access to where we came from. And I think that most people, that's just a fundamental thing that you know about yourself. You kind of know where you were born. And so that, I think, was something that plagued me for many years. Fortunately, I've been able to get in touch with other Korean adoptees, and it's finally a feeling of like hearing your story and saying I felt that way too, because it's something that we can't even describe to our white families what that's like to not be heard. That's so important. Then I guess also I think someone touched on the trauma of losing our birth family, our birth mothers, and our culture. Even if it's not in our memory, it's something that we still carry with us. You know, on I guess a cellular level. When I first went back to Korea when I was 45 years old, I say that I felt like my body was home. I couldn't even describe it. It was just a wonderful feeling. So getting sober about coming up on 10 years, it was the first time that I was able to look at all of the ways that I behaved and my abandonment issues and the reason I wasn't able to form real meaningful relationships. Also, I should add that my adoptive mother and I grew up in a lot of chaos and poverty. So those were other stressors that added to the whole racial piece. And I didn't have words to express my frustrations. I say, even though I didn't start drinking heavily until I was in my 30s, in my 20s, I certainly did binge drink. So I drank alcoholically to escape and to because I didn't know how to cope with those feelings of the fear and the bullying. And to this day, I say, I still have to tell myself the self-talk that I need to have boundaries. I need to not let people push me around and to not be bullied, because you fall into those patterns and they're hard to break, even though intellectually you know what's happening. Just being able to be assertive and stand up for myself. And when somebody says something to me, I say, no, that's not me. You don't know me. My mother did that a lot to me. And then I've had relationships, even in the last few years, where I would find myself choosing these people who were just real domineering, and that's just not, that's not me. And I feel, even though with this, quarantine, I feel very happy just to be with myself. I like, I go to Zoom meetings, I'm involved in some volunteer projects, and I fill my days. And I like the fact that it's like just some quiet reflection. I'm taking a Spanish class and I just find things to do. I feel happy as a clam, and I'm happy I don't have any other people to contend with, as far as, children to chase after or a partner, or, it's just me. And I like that. It's what I need right now.
So, Lisa, how long ago was it that you took that trip to Korea?
The first time was in 2008, and then I went again the following year on another adoptee trip, and then my last trip was in 2016.
Okay.
And yeah, it's really neat. There's something, it's kind of like, when you first come to the rooms and you hear your story and you hear people who felt the way that you did. And so when I went and I discovered the adoptee groups, it was like another layer of like, wow, somebody really can understand what that's like.
Yeah.
So you were really drawn to reach out to them.
Yeah, and that's one of my volunteer projects now. We're starting up sort of an advocacy group. There is a lot of a very high incident of suicide among the Korean adoptees. There's actually over 200,000 of us worldwide from the post Korean War till the present, even though the adoptions have tapered off. I mean, we could be our own major city. There's so many of us. But it's neat how with social media we've been able to connect over the last 10 years, and our voices are being heard for once. You know, like with all this stuff in the news about race, it's like I've been saying this my whole life. We don't live in a colorblind society. Anyway, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And David, I'm sure that you find a lot in Lisa's story that sounds familiar. Why don't I give you the floor and you can share a little bit about
Thanks,
your
John.
story. And
Yeah, I absolutely do. You know, one thing, Lisa, that you said that struck me immediately right between the eyes is that you talked about those thinking patterns and thus the behavior patterns that are hard to break. Even though we intellectually know what's healthy and what's not healthy, right? We know what works and what doesn't work, yet it's tough to do that. And it's because of any number of reasons. For me, it's because I'm age 59 and I've been doing things for a really long time in my life, but it's also because I'm an adoptee. And we have these, as a result, we have these coping or survival mechanisms that are so deeply ingrained in everything that we do and every way we look at the world. It's really difficult to extract us from that, to feel safe and to expand beyond that. And I think you articulated that extremely well.
Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. And my story is really similar. And I think, you know, as my story has evolved over time, I think I would say that as well. My intellectual understanding has grown immensely of what my story is. You know, for the first 40 some years of my life, well, I better stop and just introduce myself. Again, I'm David B. Bohl, as John said. I'm both a relinquishee, that is, I was relinquished by my birth mother, and I'm an adoptee. I was adopted into another family, and I'm a person in long-term recovery from both alcoholism and nicotine use disorder. In addition to that, I am also in a profession of being an independent addiction consultant, a clinical substance abuse counselor, and a recovery management coach. And I work with a lot of people with substance use disorders and their families who are trying to make changes. And not coincidentally, a lot of relinquishees, adoptees, those who have orphaned, those who have been fostered, have been attracted into my practice. And I've worked with a lot of people who struggle with some of the same things we're talking about. But again, for the first 40 some years of my life, my story was really simple. I was adopted as an infant. I was the first child in the family. My family later had a natural born daughter and another adopted son from a different family other than mine. I had very little information about my adoptive parents because I was adopted in the baby scoop era, where that's just the way it was. Adoptions were closed. People were told, forget about your past. Your new life starts now and move forward. And that's the way I was treated. But I was welcomed and I was loved and I was a talk of their family and friends as I was adopted in their family. And I don't recall a time when I didn't know that I was adopted. I even proudly told some friends about it. And that's just the way it was. It was part of my life. But even at a really young age, I remember feeling different from others. And at the time, it was more described that I was being timid and shy, but I think more accurately, I just never felt I fit in anywhere, and I had no idea what to do in life, though I felt that other people knew exactly what to do. And that was something that was talked about a lot when I came into recovery, and that, of course, is a characteristic very similar to adoptees as well. So, there's a hook, right? But I never attributed that to any one thing, including adoption, and that was that. I started drinking at age 13, and I experimented with other drugs as people my age and that generation were wont to do. I didn't think I was doing anything out of the ordinary. And in some ways in life, I did okay, right? I had friends, I had social circles, I was well respected, I built a career. I got married at age 24 and had 2 biological children. But shortly after they were born, my wife said, that's fine that you don't want to know anything about your adoption, but perhaps it would be fair to the children if we got some medical history so they might know what they were up against. And I couldn't argue with that, sadly, even though I had tried not to think about my adoption for most of my life by that point in time. And Wisconsin's a closed state, so I petitioned for some closed records and didn't have a lot of success. I got some family medical history and learned that my grandma died of heart disease. My grandfather had Alzheimer's, but nothing that I could show that I was genetically predisposed to anything. And at that time, I had a grand mal seizure, and doctors were pushing me to try to get this information. And so, nope, nothing there. Nothing to see here. I reached a dead end, and there was nothing like to pursue. But that doesn't end the story. I opened up a whole can of worms at that point in time. So after my 9 months after my initial contact of the state of Wisconsin, They said that they had tried to make contact with my birth mother, but they had learned that she had passed away as a result of alcoholism. And that was really interesting to me. And the timing was remarkable in that I was having a tough time in my life. My alcohol use was increasing dramatically and negative consequences were accumulating. Jack Daniels was now a part of my everyday life. And it was affecting my relationships and my ability to function in any clinical way you could imagine. And it took 9 months for me getting that information and thinking about that and thinking about my birth mother, whom I had no information about other than the fact that she had passed away. And it led me to get sober. And thankfully, I got sober. I did it with a lot of help. I went into a hospital detoxification program. I went to a residential treatment program. I was introduced to the 12 steps, and I immersed myself in a 12-step recovery and fellowship that stabilized my life in a major way. And thankfully for that, because it allowed me to do the work that I really needed to do. And that's what we're talking about in part tonight. And that's the relinquishing and the adoption part. And I had to do it, right? I had to do it. So just imagine here, I'm in AA, I do my 4th step after a period of time. That was great. 18 months later, I decided, well, you didn't really address this adoption thing, David. Let's do a 4th step on adoption. And I did. My sponsor was really good, but he was not an expert. He was not an expert, right? So I got it off my chest. And what I realized, instead of feeling great and feeling attached and welcomed and all that, I realized what an immense amount of work I needed to do around that, including attachment issues I might have had, trust issues I might have had, identity issues that were lacking because I didn't have a lot of information. So that's what I did.
That's so interesting that your family, they loved you and they were glad that you were in the house and you had a nice stable home, but it was more that didn't really compensate for the deep feeling of being relinquished by your birth mother. Exactly.
And who would know it, right? Unless I learned that somehow, it's something that happened pre-verbally, right? Pre-verbally, as I was just a newborn, I had no way of remembering that incident. So I couldn't attach any meaning to it. And I certainly couldn't describe it even if I could. And even the feelings of not fitting in or melees that I was experiencing throughout my life, I never pointed the finger at adoption. I just thought that was me, right? I thought I was defective. Something's wrong with me. I was given up for adoption, so something had to be wrong with me. So that was my assumption as I was going through these developmental periods in my life. And as I said, I suffered from relational issues like attachment and no idea who to trust, including myself. And it was all about shame. Right, it was all about shame and abandonment, betrayal, and shame. That trifecta of emotions that are so common to people in recovery and those who have been relinquished.
Right. One of the things that I thought of when I was reading your story was that I heard some stories from people where they talk about they're sharing their alcoholic story and that their families were normal, their families were fine, their parents, didn't abuse them, they were great, they were supportive, and yet they became alcoholic anyway. Exactly. And so reading your book in the beginning, the intro talks about trauma as being that, like, if I can get the words out, like as soon as there's an environment, we're a part of it. And so any sort of mother who would, either not be planning to be a mother or the stress around that, the hormones do affect, the placenta. And so therefore, you could have a perfectly normal family life and yet still have these feelings of unworthiness or just stress, extra stress.
Absolutely.
And so that was really helpful to me to see it in here in that way. And I'll share with our listeners that right before we started, I admitted that I read his book, I finished it today, but that it wasn't at the top of my list when I met him 2 years ago at the Toronto conference, because I'm not an adoptee. And so while, I do like memoirs, as other people have shared, it just, wasn't at the top of the list. So I'm glad that we did this show because, as I read the book, there was so much that I could relate to and understand better about both trauma and adoption and the shame that can, that a lot of us have that we, and it's not even that we're blaming our parents. It just seems to be part of our physicality, the body keeps the score, as they say. And so I really liked how that was talked about in your book. And it made me feel, much more open to reading the rest of your book, and I enjoyed it a lot. So I thought I'd put that out there in case there are people that don't relate to adoptees. That yeah, it was helpful to me and really opened me up to looking at some things in a different way.
Well, I appreciate that. And that certainly, I think it was a couple podcasts ago, you talked at great length about adverse childhood experiences. And this is the link that we can share, whether you're an adoptee or not. This is some language that those of us in recovery oftentimes have in common, right? So,
Right.
As I'm telling my story, and I suggested earlier that I happened upon alcohol at age 13. Well, I believe it was more than that. I believe I happened upon alcohol at a time in my life where I was totally lost, where I didn't fit in, right? I had all of these things going on, and who knows, right? The reason I identify as being relinquishing an adoptee is twofold, because it describes two different events. Being relinquished can be a real separation from mother and could cause real clinical trauma. Not attaching to the family one is adopted by, even though it's safe and they're loving and everything else, not feeling like you belong is a different type of trauma. It's a complex or a developmental trauma. And I believe that I was suffering an immense developmental interruption, right? I wasn't developing normally because I was in constant fear because I didn't feel like I was connected anywhere. And when I felt alcohol at 13, wow, that was what we term sometimes as the magic elixir, right? Some people say when they first started drinking or using drugs, it made them more socially aware and it was are able to get along, and that was partway with me. But I thought I attached to these people in meaningful ways that no other human beings had ever attached, and that's how I know, in retrospect, that I was likely drinking alcoholically at age 13. Alcohol altered my perception of reality. Right? It was no accident. This was a learned behavior that was working for an illness that I couldn't even describe until 30 years later.
Right.
David, I don't know if you can. I don't know if you can see the comments in the chat room, but Johnny wrote that your book was unbelievably helpful to him as a child of alcoholic parents, and he can't believe how useful your story was, and he thanks you for it. Just wanted to pass that on.
Well, Johnny, that's very kind, and I appreciate that commentary. I will tell you that of the people who do reach out after reading my book, a good portion of them are parents and families of people who struggle with alcoholism, or adopted parents, because they've attested to the fact that it's provided to them a better understanding of what the context was of some negative events going on.
Lisa, I was wondering about with your experience with your group, what I heard in your sharing with that is that you finally felt seen, which is, how a lot of us feel when we get to the rooms and people are sharing similar stories. In your group, do you guys talk about addiction or things? You mentioned, the suicide rate. Is it something that you have groups that you talk about it with? Or do you keep that separate, your addiction recovery and your adoption community?
Well, that's funny you asked that. I participated in a kind of an organization meeting the other day, and I kind of outed myself, and I don't typically do that, but I just said that these are issues that parallel recovery, about having a voice and the self-hatred and just wanting to belong, and that also we are all at different points in our sobriety as well as our adoption journey. Some of us, don't have any interest at all in finding our birth families. Others try very hard. But I think as I get older, I think more about my birth mother and the stress that she must have gone through, knowing that she had to relinquish me, and that I don't know if she's still alive or not, but I feel, I don't know. I never had any animosity toward her, but as David touched on, we probably both had that feeling of being relinquished and unwanted, but fortunately, as a result of being involved in the adoption groups, I don't have that feeling anymore. I feel like I'm sure that I was very much wanted, but it was the circumstances, the social constructs that in Asian culture and the poverty, and there were so many factors, and also that she didn't have any agency, and nor did the orphan babies. It wasn't our choice to come here. Um, and the narrative that we're told is that we're supposed to be grateful. And yes, we're grateful, but what they don't see is the loss and the sadness. Told is that we're supposed to be grateful. And yes, we're grateful, but what they don't see is the loss. And,
There's an
I
echoing
know.
effect.
I think there is. Lisa, yeah, you had to.
no, I don't have my thing on.
Well, yeah. Okay. Anyway, sorry about that.
There's an echoing
know.
effect.
I think there is. This is the fun of doing live streams. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're okay. Somebody might have had the window open on their computer that has the actual stream playing.
Ah,
So I put you on mute, Lisa. I don't know if you have it on there, but anyway,
I
let's
don't
take you.
think so.
There you go. Okay. Well, who knows? Oh boy, I'm sorry for that interruption. That happens sometimes. We're doing this live, and it's a stream, and sometimes the quality isn't always as good. It just depends upon what the internet is doing, I suppose. One thing I was interested in, there was a conversation on Facebook about the if this is like biological that adoptees have such a high incidence of addiction. Maybe it's because their birth parents had addiction issues, and which is why they had to relinquish their children. Do you think there's anything to that, Dave?
There can be, right? I mean, if we look at all the elements that we know that might contribute to addiction at this point in time, that being genetics and that being environment, right? Environment can be the environment in which you grew up in, the psychological aspects of it, the toxic stress, any number of things that one might have been experiencing. Yeah, I think there is something possible with that. Imagine my birth mother, who the man that helped her create me denied that he was the father, and her being sent off to a home for unwed mothers all by herself for the last 5 months of her pregnancy. Imagine how the stress she was under, right? So you talk about an unborn fetus inside of a woman and the stresses that they might be feeling. It may begin then, and absolutely that biology continues. I think there's a lot of research being done and new theories being supported that suggests that this trauma can be generational, and it is cellular in that it is biologically embedded in some capacity in the cells and passed along from generation to generation. Absolutely true. Yeah.
yeah.
That's interesting. Joe M. has written in here. He says, be careful what you wish for. The family of origin may have its own hell when you find them. He says that his aunt ratted his mom out in a drunken party. The cops were called too, and the cops called child services. So yeah. What was your experience, Dave, when you found your biological mother?
Well, it was interesting. As I mentioned earlier, I learned that my mother had died of alcoholism, and I had no idea what that meant. Right? It doesn't say alcoholism on the death certificate. Something else must have happened.
Right.
So what I was able to do, thankfully, is I was able to meet some step siblings who helped fill in some of that information. And sadly, my mother died in a shelter on the south side of Chicago of respiratory distress as a result of alcoholism. And she had struggled with it for decades. And who knows, she may have even been struggling with it when I was born. I'm not really sure. Mm-hmm. She did not, probably did not come from an alcoholic family, but had some stress in college, whereby she even went and saw some counseling professionals because she felt like she was under so much stress. Then you add an unwanted pregnancy to it, or an unkeepable pregnancy to it, and she was under massive toxic stress at that time. I learned also that my biological father, who was not identified, paternity was not legally established, but I found out who he was, also likely struggled with alcoholism. And what I can tell you is that I have some step siblings who have been known to have that problem as well. So it's an issue that oftentimes runs in families in many different ways, and I'm no exception to that rule.
Another comment from a Facebook member of our Facebook group. He says that he was adopted back in the 60s in the United Kingdom. And even though he had a very loving adopted family, the feeling of rejection was always there. Even though I was still loved by his parents, when I got to the age of 20, he began searching for his birth family. And from the age of 17, he began drinking and drugging, which was, in retrospect, a way of trying to avoid those feelings of rejection. And also, he's come to realize a way to deal with imposter syndrome. Never felt comfortable.
That feeling, and I can't speak for all adoptees, but I do hang out in those communities, and very much like Lisa, I have found support in adoptee communities, and not only getting from them but giving back to them. And this is a common theme, right? That discomfort, that uncomfortable in our own skin, no matter what intellectually might be going on in our lives. I think that's a common thread, and one that we typically need to work through in our lives. And John, you talked about those statistics earlier about adoptees, but there's so much more. Not only are those statistics true about addiction, but adoptees are also more likely to have difficulties with eating disorders and attention deficit disorder and suicide and untimely pregnancies. And we have higher rates of higher personality disorders and antisocial personality and borderline personality. But mainly, and I'm not looking for sympathy here, it's just something we need to address. And certainly if someone's trying to work a program of recovery, they need to be aware of this sooner rather than later. We have issues of loss and grief and identity development, self-esteem, and lack of information about family history that may never be resolvable, which contributes to that feeling of discomfort, right? When am I ever going to be whole? When am I ever going to feel like I've done enough? And that hypervigilance is a common thread throughout adoptees, especially those attempting to recover.
Yeah, I really liked how you talked about that in the book. That, I mean, you did, if there is a way to do AA perfectly, you were going for it, a gajillion meetings and all the inventory and all the books and all of the stuff. And yet this was still something that needed to be addressed. And I thought that was important because I know just in my experience that in early recovery, that when I was going through the steps and doing all the stuff, if I continued to feel not that great or, upset about something, I thought I was doing it wrong. And there must be something, extra wrong with me, or I missed a step or whatever. And so I liked that, by sharing your story, you showed that, you can get sober and be, sober, and yet the journey continues. And I think that's an important message to hear because, regardless of whether you were adopted or not, I think most of us, maybe there's some that are really more well than others, but being open to seeking additional help, even after you've been sober for a while, is important for the continued journey.
Absolutely, very well said. We're taught in clinical settings, and we're taught in medical settings, and we're taught in recovery settings that addiction and recovery are forever. It's something that once someone has crossed that line into a severe substance use disorder, they're likely going to have to deal with all their lives. Well, relinquishment is very much the same way. That never goes away. So there are life events that can be triggering or add pressure and toxic stress to people's lives. And you're correct. We should be at the ready to be able to deal with those things and arm ourselves in the best way possible with the tools necessary to do that work.
And Lisa, something that was interesting in your story is the whole problem about identification and feeling that you don't belong. Is that you also had that racial component where you were a Korean adoptee by a white family, you lived in a white community, and I think that you related that it was a while before you realized that you had that feeling of not belonging. Am I correct with that?
Yes, I was even sharing in one of my Zoom meetings, I don't see many people that look like me in AA. ain't a lot of Asians getting sober. If they are, they don't do it with AA.
So yeah, we have another comment from Facebook. He says, thank you. This is extremely useful for me. Again, connection for me has been the main help for my sobriety. So to hear people as yourselves sharing on the subject adds to that connection, and to know I'm not alone. Thank you. And thank you for making the comment, because I hope that these podcast episodes are useful and helpful to people. I love these. It's kind of like it's like an AA meeting and a party and a conversation. And it's just a really good thing to do on a Friday night, I think. So, but if it helps you, that's even better. So thank you so much for that comment. Now, if you'd like to call in, our phones are open, and the number is 844-899-8278. There you go. So, Angela, what was it about Dave's book that you found most compelling, that was interesting to you?
Well, like I said, I really liked the science in the intro because it was described his experience and the adoptee experience in terms that that I'm now familiar with. Again, when I first met him, I hadn't read that much. I wasn't doing my own trauma therapy and stuff, and so a couple of years later, reading that, I could understand better, and I felt more connection to what the story was about to be. I could relate to that experience better, and I liked where he talked about the value of a drunkalog, that oftentimes where, in meetings we're like, it has to be solution, and straight out of the book solution and blah, blah, blah. But I think it's our stories. I mean, stories were what got me to stay. Was hearing about people who felt as terrible as I did or had similar experiences, and then were able to overcome them. I mean, that's the main reason I stuck around. It definitely wasn't the God stuff.
I forgot about that, but you're so right. You often hear that people decry the drunkalog and everything, but I love the stories. I love speaker meetings, and I love memoirs. You just learn so much from the stories.
And the speaker meetings also, the stories, the drunkalogs, you could hear what somebody was like, in the beginning, what they did and what they're like now, ideally. But, in a lot of the meetings, you just hear how somebody is dealing with things for 5-minute increments. And I couldn't always relate to that because, they'd share that they let go and let God and they have their shit together. And I'm not at that point, and so hearing like how they went through and it worked out. So I liked when you talked about the drunkalog and the addiction memoirs when you shared about that because of how in addiction memoirs the idea of people trying, when they get to the point where they'll try anything at all. And I think that's something that I can relate to as well as, because again, I was atheist and still am. And so going to AA meetings and having to hear that stuff. And from day one, I said, I'm an atheist. I don't know if I can do this. Yet it was the only thing in town. And so I had to. And so it was, getting to that thing. The other thing I liked is he dubbed the word coins, which, makes me giggle, very creative for a community of individuals needing support. So it relates to, 12-step meetings of all different kinds. And a lot of us get coins there. And so, I love wordplay as well. So anyway, that tickled me. And if you want to talk a little bit about some of the unhelpful sayings, we talked about some in a few podcasts ago, but some of them you listed that I agree with is like the safety ones and the bossy ones and the adage of feelings aren't facts, because in my family, certain people were allowed to feel and certain people were not. And certain feelings were allowed and certain ones were not. And, and it depended on who you were, which things you got to feel and such. And so being able to feel and then recognizing my feelings is a big deal for me. And so, how it's talked about in the room sometimes is not helpful. So that was another thing that I enjoyed that you addressed in that book.
David, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the organizations you belong to, the Concerned United Birth Parents and the American Adoption Congress, and any other adoption organization that you
there are all kinds of great resources out there. Certainly the American Adoption Congress, typically in a non-COVID era, holds an annual convention that brings together any number of resources to bear upon people who are adopted in particular, but also resources for other people in the constellation, that adoption constellation that includes birth parents, relinquishing family members, adoptive parents, etc. And they have a clearinghouse of a great deal of research that's available. Concerned United Birth Parents is more bringing the different parties together and gaining understanding of how each person's perspective informs their lives and their interactions going forward. There's a group in Indiana called the Indiana Adoptee Network that I am very active in, even though I'm not in Indiana. Their work crosses state borderlines, and they're in their they missed their conference in April, but they're doing a weekly happy hour, if you will, on Friday evenings, bringing together adoptee resources, and I help them to do that. And tonight they had Nancy Verrier, who is an author and therapist, on. Nancy wrote 2 very important adoptee books. One was The Primal Wound, describing that wound that happens when the child is relinquished from its birth mother. And the other was Coming Home to Self, which is a book about identity development in the adult adoptee, and how does one develop an identity and continue their personal development when they don't have biological mirroring and other family members from which to reflect things back to them. So I'm very involved in those organizations. And of course, I also operate in the addiction realm and spend a lot of time doing that as well. But I also am a recovery manager, and I help people in their recoveries, including families. And I use that services myself. So I'm very familiar with all different types of recovery, and it's very important for me to stay abreast of that, not only for my own well-being, but for those of my clients. And I think it was so important that the Facebook commenter talked about connection, and Angela made the comment about a drunkalog. Ultimately, to me, those are just really fundamental forms of narrative therapy, right? The better able we are to tell a story about ourselves, the more mentally, quote unquote, well adjusted we are, the better we're able to deal with things in our lives and to become more resilient. So telling our story, so long as my story today is not the identical story that I told 15 years ago when I got sober, as long as that story has evolved because I've done some more work on what's going on in this world and on myself, then it's really healthy to do that, right? And as we know in the AA belief universe, sometimes these communities of individuals needing support can be really tough to navigate. I mean, that mutual aid group that uses these 12 steps, sometimes it's really difficult between their text and their culture. It's not only difficult for people who just struggle with the religious language, but they can be particularly difficult for adoptees who are always trying to seek safety. They need a safe place to do the work that's so essential. So as part of those 12-step programs, sometimes adoptees struggle over the text, and sometimes they struggle over the culture, right? This notion of powerlessness, and it's not just adoptees, it's people who have trauma, right? If trauma can render people powerlessness, and to tell them they're powerless and they have to turn to something outside of themselves is oftentimes really difficult. When trauma survivors are being taught you can marshal a personal power within yourself to deflect these things, it's a contrary message, including that unmanageability that says that you didn't manage your life, even though as an adoptee, we've existentially survived a lot of things by doing that over the years. And I think the other thing that adoptees trip over in terms of the text is that focus on the wrongs, right? Whether it's defects of character that imply that we're defective in a way. And of course, you heard me and you heard Lisa's testimony that we didn't feel quite right, or we didn't feel comfortable, or we didn't feel like we belong. It's oftentimes dangerous for trauma people to reflect on the past without some new healthy coping mechanisms, right? So telling a drunkalog in AA without knowing where to go with that flood of emotions can oftentimes be contraindicated. But it's that shame that comes from the negative focus, the focusing on the wrongs. And it's particularly, and John, you've heard me talk about this because I can't talk about this enough, that darn spiritual axiom that says if there's something that I'm bothered about, there's something wrong with me, right? And oh man, tell someone who thinks there's something wrong with them that there's something wrong with them, and you confirm the most negative narrative you could ever confirm about somebody, right? Instead of that positive, safe, validating environment that we all need to do the recovery work, whatever we're recovering from is necessary. And that's just the text alone. Then there's the culture, and a lot of us who have spent some time in those rooms. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bashing anything that works for anybody. I'm just talking about my personal experience and some others. But tough love doesn't work for trauma people, including adoptees, right? It can feel really hostile. And if it feels hostile, it's not safe. If it's not safe, we're not going to tell our stories or do the work, right? So that makes it really different. And sometimes being told, or not be told or feeling you're not welcome here if you don't do it our way, boy, that makes it feel even more unsafe, right? And I think it's really important for people to know whether they have trauma, whether they're adopted, or whether they have some outside issues. There's always a time that they need to find other people in areas of expertise to benefit them, because every solution is not necessarily found in a group that focuses on recovery from substance use disorders. There are other people that can bear witness and help with those facts. So I'll get off my soapbox for now, but those are some concerns that exist sometimes in the 12-step fellowships that are very similar to the problems that people in the AA Beyond Belief secular universe have as well.
Mm-hmm. And Lisa, I was kind of interested in what organization you belong to for adoptees.
There are several, actually. We even have a group for 50 and older. Some who are kind of on the birth search journey. Some are just, fun. Others are for advocacy as far as access to our records. That's another one is citizenship, having dual citizenship. I wanted to comment, though, on something that David was saying. I think that the way that my perspective has changed over the last 5 years or so is that I think when we first come in, we are, quote unquote, broken. But today I feel very proud of myself. It hasn't been an easy road. They tell you that fear of economic insecurities will leave us. It hasn't left, but my fear, my fear of it and the way that I approach it is I'm a survivor, and I say that I am not broken. I am resilient. I mean, the stuff that I've been through, especially the last 4 or 5 years, I feel like I've come out the other side, even though I'm not working, and I don't, I just got my unemployment, and I was kind of worried about the rent. But I don't know. I just feel so empowered and so healthy, with my network of my support network of friends and people in the program, in and out of the program.
It's interesting that you mentioned the group that helps people find their biological parents. I'm betting that is getting to be more common nowadays with people, going online and
yeah,
so
especially with the DNA testing for sure, and also for it's easier. I think I probably shouldn't speak for the whole adoption community, but younger adoptees, the records, they kept better records.
Oh yeah.
For us older ones, we don't have much hope, but adoptees from the 80s or so, 80s on, I think the records were better, and they have more chance of finding biological family members.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of the things that I was curious about, and I think David would probably have more experience in this, is I know several people in recovery who are adoptees, but it's within their family. So it was usually like a sister or somebody who, got pregnant at a young age. And so then the mother adopted the child and raised. And so, that kind of a situation. Actually, most of it is that sort of a situation, or an aunt or somebody else. And so then a child is raised thinking that their family's a certain way, and at some point finds out that no, it's actually, this person is your mother, who you think is, your sister and stuff. So I'm wondering about, your experience with that.
Well, sure. Well, that's interesting. And of course, I don't want to overly generalize anyone's story, because just like addiction stories are very complex, adoption stories are immensely complex as well. But yes, kinship adoption that you're describing happens very frequently. And sometimes it is preferable to outside placement or any number of alternatives that exist there. And oftentimes social workers or adoption placement people will look to family members to see if that's possible, because ultimately what that does is not only does it provide structure, but it helps to eliminate that secondary matter that has to be dealt with, right? So the relinquishment never truly occurs to the degree that it would occur if someone were placed outside of their family. And not all of that genetic mirroring is lost if someone is raised in their own family. However, whether someone is told or given misinformation about who they are and what their place is in the family and who's raising them, or
Right.
whether or not they're not told until they're adult, right? I know lots of adoptees who are late discovery adoptees, LDAs they're referred to as, who weren't told until they were 21, or they found out when they went to get a marriage license that they were adopted. And I can tell you, as we know in addiction and recovery circles, secrets and lies are not good things to perpetuate as one is trying to personally recover from whether it be an addiction or a trauma or some type of complex toxic stress, some developmental trauma. So it takes away that safety, right? So if family has lied to one, that's the case. And in my case, I didn't have it to that extreme, but just the mere fact that my family told me I was adopted and that was a great thing turned out to be a lie, because I was treated by some people. I was ostracized by some people and treated as less than because I was adopted, made to think that there was something wrong with me. So imagine being told, like Jack Nicholson, right? He was raised by his sister, not his mother, and he found out much later in life that leaves a lasting impact. And that means that a level of trust and attachment has to be built up. And we go back to Lisa's initial statements, right? These are the thought processes that are so ingrained and the perceptions that are so ingrained that they take a lot of work to extract the reality and the context out of them to do that. So absolutely, Angela, there are a lot of people in that boat, and they as a result have those issues to deal with as well.
And there's a lot of family secrets being uncovered now because of the different ancestry sites. My wife is really involved in that stuff, family research and so forth. And as she was doing that, she was contacted by a woman who, I think through the DNA testing, seemed to be related to Susan. And as it turns out, she was. And what it was is one of Susan's uncles apparently was stationed in the Navy on the West Coast in San Francisco, had an affair, had a child, never told anybody in Missouri, his family in Missouri, about it. And so now this woman is reaching out, and all these, her father's dead and everything, but is reaching out and to Susan, and they put the pieces of the puzzle together, and they say, oh yeah, this is your father? And this is what happened, but isn't that interesting, but I'm sure that could be, maybe traumatic for the families themselves, because I think that back in the 50s anyway, and maybe it's even to this day, there was a lot of stuff that was being swept under the rug and not being talked about.
Not being talked about and or not being investigated, because they just simply didn't have the tools that you mentioned and the genetic genealogists who are so important in our world today to help go through those things. But yes, absolutely. In the adoptee world, I can, without quoting anyone's story specifically, there are many incidences of people who thought they had an uninterrupted family line who discover at one point in time, that man couldn't possibly have fathered that child who is my grandfather, right? So there are interruptions in the chains of genealogy and genetics all over the place. Absolutely. And these, you're right, these are things that some people thought they were going to take to the grave, but science has changed all of that.
Is uncovering that. But what's cool is Susan has become friends with this new cousin, and they still stay in touch. So
neat. Yeah. Neat. Excellent.
Yeah. But I can certainly understand the trauma of, of not having that identity and searching for it. I'm sure that's something that people long for.
Absolutely. And not something we can't always complete. They're just missing links. I mean, I can't speak other than my own experience, but I do work with people who have been adopted from other countries who there is no way they're going to ever retrieve any of their birth history. And as a result, part of working a program of addiction and adoption recovery has to do with radical acceptance, right? I have to accept that that's going to be a fact. I can mourn it, I can grieve it, I can do all the right things, but that's something that I can't focus on. I can no longer hope for. So what can I now focus my efforts on?
And that's the case with Lisa, isn't it, Lisa?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to share that it's like this gaping hole, and it's something that at different times in my life, it's bothered me. And I think as I get older, it's more apparent, it's because like David said, it's just that acceptance that is something I will never know.
Yeah. Because of the circumstances surrounding that at that time with Korea.
Yeah.
Joe is writing, he says that he did his DNA research and his nieces and nephews don't have the 50% that would be required to be the same as his elder brother who looks just like him. So, yeah. I don't know what to say about that.
Well, there are excellent genetic genealogists out there, including those who can be referred by 23andMe and the other DNA sites who might help him deconstruct that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we didn't have any callers tonight, but I do hope that those of you who are listening and those who will be listening in the future have found this discussion helpful. It was really great to have David and Lisa on here. One of the best things about doing this podcast for me is all the friends that I've made while doing it. And I count David and Lisa and Angela among those friends. And all of you who listen as well, and the people who are participating in YouTube and on Facebook. It's just so much fun. I love all of you. So thank you so much for listening.
Yes,
And
thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion today and learned a lot. So I really appreciate Lisa and David sharing their experience with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
And now, the music. And that's it. That's another episode of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. Thank you, everybody, for listening. It was great to be here. Sorry about the sound quality issues we may have had today, but that's not a big deal. If you would like to participate in supporting AA Beyond Belief, the podcast and website, you can do so in a couple of ways. You can visit our Patreon site, patreon.com/AA Beyond Belief. That's right, yeah. And just become a subscriber. We have I think 40 subscribers now, and it's very nice. So thank you so much for that. And you can also donate through PayPal, paypal.me/AA Beyond Belief, or go to our website. And I think that's about it. So thanks, everybody. We'll be back again next Friday for another Sober Distancing episode. I'm not quite sure what we'll be discussing, but we will be posting that real soon. Take care, all.